Good evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this public lecture, Surviving COVID-19 and a Military Coup as a Garment Worker, as brought to you as part of the 2021 Women in Asia Conference. My name is Beck Strading. I am the Executive Director of Trobe Asia at La Trobe University. And I would like to begin this event by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which La Trobe University sits. And I would like to pay my respect to their people, both past and present. And we recognise that people are participating in this event, as well as the Women in Asia Conference, from the lands of many traditional custodians. So I would like to extend my respect to other Indigenous people who are present tonight. La Trobe Asia is very proud of our efforts to engage the public in thoughtful debate and to deepen our understanding and knowledge of the region in which we live. And we are particularly proud to be supporting the 2021 Women in Asia Conference. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce Associate Professor Kirsten Steiner of the La Trobe University Law School to introduce our speakers for this evening. But before I hand it over to you, Kirsten, I did want to inform our audience members tonight that there will be some time for Q&A at the end of the session. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box throughout the lecture. Welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Beck. And on behalf of the women organizers, Dr. Wendy Mee, Associate Professor Shelley, and Dr. Emerald King, and myself, we are delighted to kick off our conference program today with this public lecture with La Trobe Asia. The public lecture today will provide insights from a fascinating empirical study on female garment workers in Thailand and Myanmar and the impact the recent military coup and the global pandemic had on this group of workers. And I think everyone who has done empirical work knows how difficult it is to do it on the best of times, to do it while a military coup takes place and a global pandemic. That is unbelievable. So well done. And I think it is an absolute fantastic reflection of the conference theme of fashioning gender in Asia. So kicking this off. It is also a pleasure that my former colleague, Associate Professor Shelley Marshall, and her colleague Sara Todt have agreed to provide us with the insight from this exciting studies. Shelley is the director of the RMIT Business and Human Rights Center with work and research experience of over 30 years in corporate accountability and human rights responsibility for businesses. Themes on which she has also published widely, including her recent book, Living Wage, published by Oxford University. She has been successfully engaging with policymakers, civil society worker organizations, and businesses on how to implement law to improve the conditions of workers. In her free time, she also co-founded the Australian Corporate Accountability Network, where she is on the steering committee. Sara is currently undertaking her PhD at RMIT on challenges faced by garment workers in Myanmar. She's also a member of RMIT's Business and Human Rights Center and is responsible for the social media channels of the center. Prior to her doctoral studies, she worked in PR and communications in Sweden. So without further ado, Shelley and Sara, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. While Sara is getting our presentation up, I would also like to acknowledge that I am on Woiwurrung land and also acknowledge any elders online and Indigenous peoples. And to thank the organisers so much for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to present on our research. So Sara and I are going to be presenting our findings about how workers have been surviving COVID-19 and a military coup, and relating that to how we can fashion regulatory strategies of solidarity in the economic north. So how we in Australia might be able to put in place laws, regulations that support those workers. Next slide, Sara. So we're going to be taking you through a bit of a circuitous route to get to our final lessons for regulatory solidarity. We'll be starting out with our questions and interventions. We're going to be setting up as our kind of proposition conflicting conceptions of garment workers that we see very commonly in the media, and making an argument about how they are informing regulatory strategies. Our third part is our dense theoretical part of our presentation. So we ask you to have a big sip of water and bear with us as we get through that, but it'll become clear to you why we want to take you on that journey. And then we're going to be addressing our empirical research on Thailand and Myanmar before getting to those lessons. Next slide. So our big questions are, how can we understand the experience of female garment workers in Thailand and Myanmar? And really importantly, how do we conceive of our relationship with them? And I say that as somebody who's sitting in the global north, in Australia, although I'm assuming many of you are sitting elsewhere. So to think about what is your relationship with those garment workers through global garment production networks, and what does a model of regulatory solidarity look like? And I'm going to be using this term quite a lot. It's our term, but by solidarity we mean a feeling, a sense of unity, and in particular, a sense of supporting the aspirations of these workers. And this idea of solidarity has become really important to me as I've been carrying out research work throughout Asia, because it's so important to those workers in the way that they relate to each other in terms of what they've been asking for. So our kind of theoretical intervention is to challenge the conceptions of femininity which underpin the public and private governance of global production networks. And it's through this intervention that we hope to speak to the big themes of this conference. Next slide. So you will have noticed in the media, but also in the academic literature and in the non-governmental kind of policy literature on garment workers, that there are really kind of opposite, conflicting conceptions of garment workers. So on the one hand, we've seen that garment workers have been leading the democracy movement in Myanmar, that they have been at the front line of protests against the coup. And yet, on the other hand, we so frequently see garment workers depicted as powerless and exploited. And that is frequently coming from the groups that are advocating for regulatory interventions or for our sympathy or for changes in consumption practices, seeing the workers as powerless, as downtrodden, and so on. And we are going to be mounting an argument, next slide, about the ways that these conceptions influence the kinds of regulatory interventions that tend to occur or that we think ought to occur. So if we think that women garment workers are at the forefront of protests, if we see them taking grave risks to keep working, and if we see them as breadwinners, then that might lead us to develop regulatory strategies that enhance their agency. So we're calling those active regulatory solutions. Whereas if we think of them as all of the stereotypes about docility, being disposable, garment work being temporary, doing something that they do just for the first few years of their working lives before they go on to parent or whatever it is, then we might put in place passive regulatory strategies which don't aim to enhance the agency and empower these workers. In fact, if we think of them as being entirely powerless, then it makes sense for us to put in place top-down regulatory strategies. So it's this dichotomy that we're going to be working with and trying to unpack as we move through this presentation. Next slide. So we now enter our dense theoretical section of our presentation, where we want to set up a conception of garment global production networks as gender regimes, and we'll be explaining why. Next slide.
Yes, so Shelley has already mentioned global production networks, and sometimes we talk about these as value chains or supply chain networks, or supply chain, value chains and supply chains. And the reason why we really want to use the GPN, the Global Production Network analysis, as a lens to unpack and explore these questions and these conceptions that Shelley has outlined is because as an analysis, it expands to include actors as social beings. And as such, as these actors in production, in these networks, as linked not only by commercial dynamics, but by social dynamics as well. So it links consumers in the economic north through these firms and through these networks to workers in these garment producing countries. And in really complex ways that are not just about price setting or power in relation to commercial dynamics, but also in relation to gender. And we look at and draw on feminist perspectives on global production that unveils how global production in itself is creating gendered identities. And in providing a perspective on this, of how global production creates gendered identities and social relations, it is also a critique to previous conceptualizations of gender in global production that has not sufficiently, according to these feminist researchers, paid attention to how GPNs are not gender neutral structures. They are not just gendered by their interactions with local gender relations that create in themselves these gender identities. And as such, we want to bring in this lens of gender regimes to better focus on how GPNs are gender patterns that spans across the productive and the reproductive sphere and social relations. And gender regimes are patterns of gender in organizational or social units. And as individuals, we're embedded in many different gender regimes. And gender regimes has been theorized by different researchers, and among them, Raywin Connell, who focus on how we can map out gender regimes in different organizations and sort of draw out these wider themes. And we integrate in that perspective of gender regimes to really focus on how GPNs as a model that's not just actor-centric or firm-centric view of global production, but one that takes into account human relations and emotions, gender divisions of power, culture and symbolism, and gender divisions of labor, to really focus on how GPNs both create and are shaped by gender patterns of consumption and production.
So as consumers, we're all part of the private governance of global production networks. So we are setting up here a conception of governance. Governance means to steer, it means to coordinate, to control, to exercise power over. And one of the ways that lead firms, so in the context of garment production networks, we're talking about brands, so well-known ones like Nike and H&M, but thousands and thousands of brands across the world. And they are shaping production networks through governance, and they do that to extract rents, and they do that to try to put themselves in an advantageous position and ensure that the production network is running as smoothly as possible. But in doing so, they're also shaping gender dynamics, and they're producing gender. So GPNs consist of both global commercial dynamics and local social structures. And this diagram here tries to kind of show you these different levels. It connects consumers in the economic north to workers in the economic south. And one of the things that's becoming increasingly accepted, both in the feminist literature and I think more broadly in Australia and in other countries, is this idea that increased information flows enable a transfer of concern to consumers for distant others. And there's this kind of role for female consumers in particular of an ethics of care. So this idea is shaping consumerism, and it's resulting in far more consumer practice based on ethical and moral considerations. And this in turn influences lead firm behaviour and the way that they are governing global production networks. So we accept that women are particularly important ethical consumers who are both shaped by and shape global production networks. But we're also critical of this perspective for a number of reasons. One is that it puts us as women in the global north, it positions us as primarily consumers, which is within the private realm, within our households. And of course, that's not all we are. As Sara said, we're also embedded within local gender institutions. We're also shaped and shape various other networks. And it limits, I think, again, our conception of the agency of women within production networks. Next slide. So we want to insist that as citizens, we're also part of the public governance of global production networks. And that public governance includes, at the macro international level, different forms of trade governance, such as through the WTO. It includes regional trade and development pacts. It includes regulation in Australia and other consumer countries, including trade laws, regulation around trade access. Quality standards have a huge effect on what can come to Australia, what's produced, how it's produced, and then laws about labour conditions in Australia also interact with laws elsewhere. And then there's ethical procurement regulation, which is at this stage the only form of kind of transnational labour regulation that we have. In Australia, we have the Modern Slavery Act, and we're going to be touching on that later. So we want to insist that as citizens, we're both shaped by and have the power to shape, however limited, the public governance of global production networks, and of garment global production networks in particular. Next slide. So we're now going to turn to our empirical research and to describe the meso level of gender regimes in Thailand and Myanmar. And this is looking at that local, national level or kind of regional level of the global production network, and to see the ways that it's socially embedded and it interacts with local gender institutions. Next slide.
Yes, so when we refer to meso level, what are we really referring to? What is it sitting within? And Shelley has already touched upon it a little bit before. We're thinking about gender as this macro level social institution that really structuring social relations in all societies. And so we conceptualize here the gender institution as being constituted in meso level gender regimes and micro level individual behavior and choices. And as we said before, as individuals, we're embedded in multiple gender regimes in different organizations and social units, such as our families, our workplaces, our local communities. And these gender regimes, they reproduce the gender institution, but they also differ from it. So there are tensions between different gender regimes in how they're influencing our individual choices and behaviors. And we're focusing here on how the global garment production networks have this meso level, these meso level gender regimes that intersects with local gender institutions, and how they become a gender regime in addition to other gender regimes that women garment workers are trying to navigate and adapt to and make choices and decisions around. And we're really focusing on what that looks like in the context of change.
So with that kind of theoretical background behind us, we first want to take you through garment workers in Thailand and the empirical work that I carried out there. So this project is an example, we think, of a kind of regulatory solidarity. It entailed participatory action research between 2019 and then in person, and then ongoing contact since then. It was funded with a grant from the Japanese government and commissioned then by the International Labour Organization. And the job was to work with the Thai Department of Labour Protection, which sits within the Ministry of Labour, and HomeNet, which is the worker organisation that represents workers, to develop enforcement methods to protect home workers in the garment and fishing industries, and also to advance the aims of the Thai Home Worker Protection Act. So there's a fantastic act that actually regulates supply chains at the local level. It was enacted in 2010, and then the Department of Labour Protection did nothing to enforce it because they just didn't know how. So this project involved the active participation of workers, worker organisers, and the relevant government agency. Next slide. So what did the participatory action research involve? Well, it involved a huge amount of eating. Basically, wherever we went, there was eating. This shows that there was eating when we were doing stakeholder meetings. There was eating when we visited the homes of garment workers, and then we ate afterwards and when we talked over the research. So we went together, and if you can look at the photo that's on the bottom left-hand side, at least on my screen, where we're all sitting around facing each other on the ground, you can see that there are people from the Labour Protectorate, there are labour inspectors who are trying to learn about the conditions of workers. In this house, there were 3 workers who are garment workers who are working within global production networks who are telling us their story. There are worker organisers. We had actually people from the Chamber of Commerce coming along quite often as well. And this process was one both of exploration, we were all learning together, but it was also a process of amazing kind of consensus building as we gained a shared understanding of the dynamics that were resulting in underpayment and poor working conditions. And if you can see that picture, which looks a bit like a map, that's the result of a participatory mapping exercise that we did with groups of workers, where we tried to understand what Sara has just described as that kind of meso level interaction between the local gender institution and the GPN. So we tried to understand who are the powerful actors within the neighbourhood. Where do you get your work from? How does that map on geographically? Where does it go after that? Who would you go to if you wanted to try and increase your power? Who are the gatekeepers and so forth? And we map that out on these physical maps as a way of trying to understand not just the commercial relationships, but also these really important social relationships. Next slide. So to give a little context, in 1992, garment production was a really important part of Thailand's economy. By 2009, it had shrunk to 1.9. And this was partly because of Thailand losing competitiveness just as it developed, and its official wage levels increased. Also because a whole lot of other countries entered into the cut, make and trim, kind of that lowest level of garment production. And one of those countries was Myanmar, as we're going to come to. At the local oriented sector, cheap imports from those competitor countries also undermined local production for domestic markets. And all of this resulted in a deindustrialization. So work moved out of the big factories with the formalized jobs where there's a manager and an employer, and it moved into homes and small workshops. So one of the things that this did is it made those informal relationships so much more important. It made the gender institutions of, for example, the family, the caring responsibilities, the reproductive responsibilities, it put them at the forefront of garment production. They're happening right there in the same place. Next slide. So we have home-based workers or workers working in now smaller workshops. So that might be a workshop with Safe by Friends, it might be 20 workers, it might be a kind of a small factory with maybe 40 workers. And those workers will normally be working, trying to pull in work from different sources. So they might be working within the domestic cut making, they might be providing production to a domestic cut make and trim factory. So that factory is outsourcing some of its work. That work then gets exported to a foreign garment factory, which is then sold on, you know, to us through those big retailers, for example. Or they might be working for or getting kind of work from a micro entrepreneur garment producer, and these are called, this is called the cutting floor in Thai. And these are people who often have a stall at a local wholesale garment market, or they might have a few, or they might sell on to them. There could be a few stages in between. After it goes to the local wholesale market, it goes on to the local retail market, and then often buyers from Singapore, from the Middle East and so forth will go to those wholesale markets, and they'll buy from there, and they'll take it to the kind of low-end garment markets in those countries. So you can see that even though often we think of these kind of global production networks as just kind of one thing, there's this competition, and workers are just trying to pull work in wherever they can. And as I said, what's so important about this deindustrialization is that personal relations became so important for getting work. The workers don't have formal contracts, they don't have paperwork, they have a relationship with someone that they're who's higher up in the value chain and who are there trying to get work from. And this makes, I mean, even though we're always embedded in gender institutions, it makes these gender institutions so much more influential, I think, on the nature of the work, and also on the way that women are thinking about their aspirations and what they want. Next slide. So in addition to this work that occurs, Sara, do you mind just stopping that video for a second? Thank you. So in addition to this kind of work that's going on in homes and small workshops, there has been more and more and more people pouring in from Myanmar. And this particular part of the work that's going on in the garment industry in Thailand has expanded greatly during the coup in particular. So if you can see on the left-hand side, there's a picture of little shacks. So many workers live in these little shacks, or they come across daily, or at least before the coup, they might come across daily. So Sara, are you able to take that video back to the start again? It doesn't matter. So if you can see that boat that was going across the river there, so the boat, the left-hand side, which I'm standing on, is Thailand. The right-hand side there is Myanmar. And I don't know if you can see, but in the distance there's a bridge, and the bridge is that's the formal border between Myanmar and Thailand. And there's actually a passport control on that bridge where you're supposed to get your passport checked, and you have to show that you're a migrant worker. But in reality, what happens is that little boat that you could see there just goes back and forth all day, bringing workers from Myanmar over for their work, or, you know, workers are going back. Workers aren't going back so much anymore, and Mae Sot and other border towns between Myanmar and Thailand have become really kind of big refugee camps and sites of garment work. Next slide. Is it going to let you go? So, oh, there you go. Yeah, go back one. Back again, if you can. Yeah, there we go. All right. So this shows you what a garment factory looks like in Maysod. So often they're just kind of set up in warehouses. They're not purpose-built factories. They're more opportunistic, I would say. The picture on the top left shows that's the size. I think there's about 40 machines there. You can see that it's very badly ventilated and cleaned. You can see the spider webs. That was amazing, the number of spider webs in this one particular place. And on the bottom right-hand corner is what workers who are living there, where they live. So they live on site. So there's often a few buildings. One will be where the work occurs, and then there's another one which has kind of multiple beds within rooms, and the workers cook and they clean and they do their laundry all in the same place. So what you can see, it's out of the screen, but on the left-hand side of that domestic scene is actually the factory that we're looking into there. So this has become now a really important site of production for garments in Asia. And although obviously we can see that it's on the one hand there are poor conditions, on the other hand this has been an incredible source of survival and of income and of resilience for these workers. And we want to come back to that point later. Next slide. So asking women what they wanted, mainly they wanted higher wages. They wanted to be able to send their children to good schools. They were really hoping to send their kids to university. In fact, that would be the number one thing that they would say. And they were generally the breadwinners. They were generally the ones who were making money, not just for their families, not just for their nuclear families, but often for their extended families. They wanted to save up enough to set up another business. Often they had business aspirations, or they wanted to move kind of higher to a higher value added part of the value chain. They were desperate for information about the global production network. They wanted to know how it worked, how they might get access to international buyers and better terms. And they wanted to try to develop better business models without burning social bridges. So as we said, this work depends so much on maintaining good social relations. Over to you, Sara, to talk about Myanmar.
Yes, so we have these two studies that very much interlink and build on similar findings, but the Myanmar study that is part of my doctoral research with Shelley as my supervisor really explores these dynamics that Shelley's been talking about in this context of great change in Myanmar. And so the aim of the study that took place in Myanmar in 2020 and 2021 is to explore how women's lives are shaped by work in global garment production, but also coming back to that embeddedness that we were talking about in our theoretical piece, how their lives in turn also shape global garment production. And really, again, in the context here of how women garment workers are navigating change in the context of COVID-19 and the military coup. So what this study looks like, we've been able to track 24 garment workers over a short period of time where a lot of change has taken place. So we've done two sets of interviews with the same 24 women garment workers, with the first round taking place between December and January 2020 and 2021, and round two taking place as recently in June 2021. And this is a collaborative field research study done together with our research partner Ang Yin Him in Myanmar. And the interviews that we did consisted of two parts, the service style question part and the structured question part to really give the women an opportunity to delve into themes and topics that they wanted to discuss and things that they thought were important. But some examples of interview questions that we asked. First round, we really asked them about the decisions to start work in the garment industry. And we also touched upon the context of COVID-19, how they were making decisions in that context. In the second round of interviews, we asked them about what changes they'd experienced after the coup and what kinds of support and what these women wanted in that context to really explore what they felt that they needed. So this method of conducting 2 rounds of interviews has really allowed us to track the change that they've experienced in this small amount of time, but that is quite substantial. And just to give you a little bit of a brief overview of Myanmar as a country that's seen an immense amount of change over the last decade. We had some sanctions by the US and EU in place during the last time the military was in power, and that was removed in 2016, from which the garment industry has just expanded and increased and grown. Like Shelley was saying, it's becoming a new player in the global market of attracting sourcing. And then with COVID-19, as much like for many other countries producing garments, garment workers were really hard impacted by these restrictions and demand for fashion dropping. So we have this first round of interviews just in December of 2020 and January 2021 that asked the women about that context of COVID-19. And then the second round just after the military coup to really capture that change. And so just starting off, we're talking a little bit about the impacts of COVID-19 and what happens when we here in the economic north stop consuming fashion, which we did en masse when COVID restrictions hit, and fashion brands responded by stopping and pausing their orders, delaying payments, which in turn translated into factories in countries like Myanmar abruptly having to lay off workers. And these workers had to navigate this by many of them temporarily moving back to their hometowns, to the rural towns. All of the workers that we've interviewed in Myanmar had moved to the city of Yangon from their rural home villages. They had migrated for work. So when they lost work for substantial parts of 2020, most of them between April and December 2020, many of them were forced to move back home to be able to survive and couldn't stay in the city without any income. And they talk about how these abrupt layoffs really disturbed and disrupted their decision-making process around work. And we discerned some themes in terms of how are they surviving COVID-19, how are they using their agency, and how are they showing resilience in this time of change. And I've just touched upon this temporary migration, moving back to your home village. And that has often to do with how Shelley was describing in Thailand, that the way these workers are living, they're really living and working in the same space. So when work stops, when there is no more work, there is really nothing to keep them in the city, but also no way for them to pay to be there and to work there. So they have to go back home. And in the context of COVID-19, there were a lot of worries. We see this first quote here, how the worker's mother was really worried about COVID-19 and she came back to the village. And then when she tried to go back, she was worried that she wouldn't be able to get a new job. And that is a theme within the theme of moving back temporarily to your home village, that it comes with that risk. Do I leave the city and go back home, and hopefully, and then risk not getting a job when I come back? And another part that we found was that some women who had worked for European-owned factories had gotten access to support funding through a rapid relief fund from the EU. And they really talked about how important that type of access to support funding had been for them and their families. Coming back to the point that Shelley was making before, how many of these women are breadwinners for their families? They're the income providers. So when they lose their jobs, when they lose their income, that's really detrimental to the whole family. And this goes to connect to this point about how being without work from April to December of a year really erodes their savings, hard work savings that they try to save up for future aspiration, to put their kids to school, to put their kids to university, to take care of their siblings. And a lot of the women that we talked to talked about having to go to pawn shops and taking jewelry that they had, family jewelry that they might have bought as a saving. They talk about how they have to live off their grandparents' pensions sometimes. One of the women here is saying, we had to struggle, we had to pay the rental fees of a house. We had to go request the owner of the house to wait for the payment. And I earned money by working as a mason. And when I got money, I had to pay the people who run owned. So this really circle of eroding savings, eroding their resilience for future negative impacts, which did happen on the 1st of February when it looked like demand for garment was sort of slowly increasing after the first impacts of COVID-19. Myanmar had a military coup where the military regained power again. Excuse me. And a lot of garment workers lost their jobs in the wake of this coup as garment fashion brands responded by pausing their orders to try and assess the situation, of course. And we saw what was really fascinating, garment workers at the forefront of these protests. And in industrial zones where these factories are located, they were organized by unions and they were really at the forefront here protesting, holding up the fist in the air, the free fingers that we've seen pictures of. And workers are talking about now how they're still worried about what will that impact me today, because they really took a risk to go out and protest. And that kind of changed in March, where there was a violent clash between protesters and the military in one of those industrial zones that saw a lot of garment workers flee Yangon. And then we also saw the military imposed martial law in many of these zones that held loads of garment factories as a response to these protests. And coming back to this rapid reactions by firms in this global production network, what we saw during the coup was that factories were responding to uncertainty in the network and how fashion brands really was making it very difficult for factory management to make decisions. So what they were doing was, what the workers had told us, was they reduced lunch hours, cutting overtime, which is a really key piece to understand how garment workers are able to save money is by taking on overtime. So by cutting that overtime, they're really reducing their propensity to save and build resilience against these potential job losses in the future. And they were introducing half-day workdays, alternating workforces, paying daily wages. And so all of this creates uncertainty and increased difficulty for the workers to make decisions about their safety and survival in this very riskful environment. And one of the workers are talking about how they're trying to find that information that Shelley was talking about and how that becomes even more important in this time. And how are the workers navigating the coup? So the workers are having to make these really difficult decisions between leaving and staying in the city that we talked about in relation to COVID-19 as well. And now it's also about their physical safety in the city, and they're talking about how they're taking risks if they're staying in the city and going into work. One worker is saying here that I have to work for my living, so I came back here. Of course, I'm scared to work. So there is that risk taking that's happening by these garment workers, and how they're really seeing their roles and responsibilities as income providers for the family as important in that decision. And there is huge amount of uncertainty in that decision making and lack of information, access to information of where is jobs available, where can I find a job that not just provides me a daily wage for the next day, but potentially for a couple of months at least, and how long would that last? So there are a lot of worries around that. And in terms of outlooks on the future, one of the workers here is saying we were expecting the good things will come after COVID-19. So there was this hope for something good, and instead, but as things changed, I was so angry. If possible, I will give my life. There's really this passion in how they're looking at the situation, which also connects to why they were going out and protesting, because these jobs are really important to these workers. And we again asked the women, what support do you need at this moment? What support are you looking for? And this piece of statistics is coming from a survey that our research partner did with 220 garment workers. So it's a little bit of a bigger group of garment workers that's answered this question. I think it's really important to point out that the no response question is quite common. Workers are finding it difficult to know what they need and trying to conceive of a future. They're really just trying to survive day to day in this moment. But what they point out is really important is to regain their jobs, to keep their jobs, and to have some sort of cash support. So the income part of this is really important to the workers, but also just finding some sort of livelihood opportunities. Some of the workers pointed out as well that hostel support would be something that they would really benefit from, being able to stay in the city, perhaps finding that, reducing that uncertainty in their decision making a little bit for them. We're going to build on these insights as we take you through our lessons for regulatory solidarity.
Thanks, Sara. So to end our presentation, we want to talk about what we see as the lessons about what we can be doing in the realm of private and public governance to build solidarity for these workers. Next slide. So very quickly, there are things that garment workers want in terms of changing the local institution. So social connectedness is so important to them. They want to make sure that this crisis doesn't, both COVID and the coup, doesn't result in isolation, which is, as we've explained, is not just about being socially isolated, but it means being economically isolated. It cuts them off from information. It cuts them off from commercial opportunities and really vital knowledge about how to navigate this incredibly difficult situation. They want to feel as though they have self-worth. And this is something that we're really interested in building on. They want to know that there's some form of career progression, and they want to be able to come back to work and to move in and out of work as they have children. These are all things that we think that lead firms, that companies in Australia who are sourcing from Myanmar could be helping to support. And we think that these are vital things to ask of companies as a responsibility of producing in these countries. Next slide. So there's a whole lot of ways that we've put in red, and really this kind of reiterates the demands that we think that should be placed on companies, but also that can be built on in other ways to make life easier and to help these women survive. So reducing uncertainty about jobs and wages, providing information, safe housing. That might mean housing in the cities where work occurs, or it might mean helping to relocate them and move them to safer housing elsewhere. Garment workers have been shot. They are being targeted in the housing that's being provided because they're living in one area in Myanmar. It's very easy to target them, and they need to be helped to be safe. We need innovative forms of financial support and, as we said, support for temporary migration. Next slide. So, coming back to our original provocation about these conflicting conceptions of gendered agency. Yes, on the one hand, these women are having an incredibly hard time. They are going through really, a historically difficult crisis. But that doesn't mean that they are not active regulatory agents. And again, we're making an argument based on our findings that see that these women are the active breadwinners. They're the forces behind collective democracy movements and movements for better pay. And that we ourselves are not just consumers, but we're citizens. So our agency extends across private and public realms. So next slide, what does this mean? Well, it means that we think we should be supporting forms of transnational labour regulation that increase all of our agency. It means supporting things like framework agreements between international brands and international union bodies. It means supporting collective bargaining across the global production network. So local unions and then global unions and negotiations with both the brand and managers or owners of factories occurring together to try to change the rules of the game within the global production network. It means setting up an international garment compensation scheme with a right of remedy and also the capacity to assist with things like crisis housing. And we think that should be a condition of being sourcing from these countries, is that companies should have to pay into an international compensation scheme. And it means ethical certification, which has worker-led monitoring, which involves workers in a monitoring, instead of something like a Modern Slavery Act or a disclosure regime in which companies in the economic north report on the risk of modern slavery or their operations in general, where there's no right of remedy for workers, where the monitoring is occurring by monitoring companies, not involving workers, and which doesn't have any features that empower workers. We think we need something more like this ethical certification with worker-led monitoring over ethical buying guides, which put the burden of ethical action on us as women without actually empowering us as public actors that can shape the public governance of production networks. So do we have another slide, Sara? No. So to conclude, we hope that we've convinced you that we need to be moving towards far more active transnational regulatory solutions that build solidarity for these workers.
Well, thank you, Shelley and Sara, for sharing your fascinating and really important research. There are a number of questions in the Q&A chat box. So what I'm going to do, because we only have a few minutes left, in the interest of time, I'll ask 3 and get you to respond, and then I'll hopefully get another round in. So let's see how we go. First question, could you say a little more about how these women and their families have compensated for the loss of livelihoods and incomes? You mentioned pawning goods, but also interested in debt accumulation and alternative labour modalities, if your findings are showing such things. Wendy Me, one of the conference organisers, is asking, is it fair to say that garment workers in Myanmar's industrial zones are more easily mobilised by unions and international organisations than the garment workers in Thailand, where homework, outwork, informal setups seem evident? And what are the implications of this difference in terms of regulatory solutions? And the next question I'll pose in this round, what are the major brands in Australia that engage these garment workers? So Shelley, I might start with you and you can respond to the parts that you want to respond to, and then I'll get Sara to comment after that.
Yeah, I'll let Sara say more about the how workers responding to loss of livelihood. Yes, that was an astute observation about the differences in capacity to collectively organise workers between Myanmar and Thailand, where there's been deindustrialisation. But there has still been very, very successful organising. It's just not occurring. It's not unions. It's women-led workers' organisations that don't get formal union recognition, but they do an amazing job of collectivising. They do all of the things, as well as kind of acting as support and development organisations. So I think there's a really important role for bringing those organisations in, rather than just working with the formal unions. And in terms of major brands, I mean, really it's kind of all of them. In terms of, because most of them will source from a whole lot of different countries. So in terms of sourcing from Myanmar, I mean, they'll source from Myanmar, they'll source from Cambodia, they'll source from Pakistan, from Bangladesh. Different things will be coming from those countries. So it's kind of hard to say that any of them aren't producing, because Myanmar has, well, at least did become such a big producer and exporter. Sara, do you want to say something about loss of livelihood strategies?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what you said, we have some brands that are specifically saying that they are sourcing from Myanmar. That doesn't mean that the other ones who don't say that they are not. So I think saying that you are sourcing from Myanmar at this time and making official statements about that is already a key step of actively engaging with the situation and saying that you have responsibility there. In terms of how workers are responding to loss of income and sort of alternatives that they have, and in Myanmar, there has been some reports of how this is pushing some women into sex work, which is not something surprising in these kinds of crises, what we've seen with garment work shutting down. Most of them, like we talked about, temporarily migrate to their home villages where they can pick up some sort of seasonal work, farm work, work that they have moved away from because it doesn't pay as much or exposes them to physical risks or other types of risk of modern slavery risks. So they are forced to move back to works that they have perhaps left before. And they also talk about this in the interviews, how they felt proud of being able to work in a factory, not out on the field. So really shifting them back into things that they've moved away from.
I think we're going to get another round of questions in. So I think you may have touched on this, Shelley. Do you have a sense of the extent to which a brand based in Australia or the US might have a primary supplier relationship with a PRC or China-based company? I've just momentarily lost my Q&A screen. China-based company, which then informally subcontracts to Myanmar. Another question here, more of a comment that you might like to respond to. Western consumers are more motivated to make ethical choices to support solidarity movements when workers are depicted as vulnerable victims lacking agency and choice. It would be great to hear your views on that, Sara and Shelley. And final question that we're going to get time for is about remittances. Could you say a little bit about the remittances that Thailand-based factory workers send back to families in Myanmar? How much do they send? How do they send it? And what are they used for? So Shelley might start with you and then Sara can have the final word.
I guess starting with that kind of Western consumers being motivated by the idea of powerlessness. I mean, I think that's something that we really want to challenge, and we think we need to start challenging more, and we need to have dialogue with the NGOs who are kind of putting forward that particular conception, again, because we think it leads to regulatory solutions that aren't addressing the kind of all the problems and all the aspirations of workers. Yes, a lot of the sourcing occurs through agents, and often there will be a Chinese, Taiwanese factory owner or that owns factories in multiple countries, or may have a very close business relationship with that intermediary that sources the work. So they're complex value chains, and Australian companies are small players, but that doesn't mean they don't have responsibility, ethical responsibility. Yeah,
and it doesn't mean that not big other brands are selling to Australian consumers, but they're not Australian brands. So that is also a really important part of the Australian market.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a question we haven't addressed.
I think it was about remittances and how
remittances. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I mean, remittances are so important, and crucially, not just for workers, Burmese workers that are in Thailand, but as Sara was saying, for Burmese workers, that garment workers in Myanmar who are sending huge amounts of their income home to their villages, and in all cases supporting the aspirations of so many people. These are really important economic agents, and although they're not earning as much as we want them to be earning, and although it's a pittance in terms of the overall cost of production, it's a good wage in Myanmar. I mean, those when it existed, while workers were still getting paid, it was a, you know, a decent wage compared with what you might be able to earn in your village, for example. So the economic importance of remittances domestically and internationally is so, so important.
Did you have anything that you wanted to add, Sarah?
No, I think that's a very good place to end, somehow, to just say how important these jobs are to these women, how they're really ready to fight for them, and that we, with this kind of model, I'm just saying, how can we fight for them in return? Because I think that is also really important to see how much risk they're willing to take, just how many changes they're willing to embrace in their livelihood structures, and what that is worth to us, and place some more worth on that in terms of how we think as consumers and as citizens.
Well, thank you both for sharing your research and your expertise with us this evening. It has been a fabulous presentation, and the comments in the chat box are really reinforcing just how much our audience members have got out of that conversation. And I'm sure that these are conversations that will continue on throughout the conference, which begins tomorrow at midday, the Women in Asia conference, and it will go for Wednesday and Thursday, and there will be a postgraduate workshop on Friday as well. You can find more information at the website, which is wiaconference.com. We might be able to put that in the chat box too, but we're really looking forward to having more of those really rich discussions about women in Asia. So thank you, Shelley, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to our organisers for putting together that excellent list of speakers. And we've got family members in. Do you want to wave to all our audience members?
Hey, Maddie.
And on that note, I would like to thank our audience members for excellent questions. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get to all of those questions, but certainly that was a fascinating discussion. So thank you again, and good night.
Thank you.